Most people who think they could survive medieval life imagine swords, grit, and a kind of romantic hardship. They assume the danger was obvious and external wars, bandits, the occasional famine. What usually goes unexamined is how quickly medieval systems broke the unprepared, not through dramatic violence, but through ordinary routines. Survival wasn't about bravery or strength. It was about familiarity with invisible rules, biological tolerance, and social obligations you would violate without realizing it. The truth is that most modern people wouldn't fail after weeks or days. They would fail within hours because medieval life punished ignorance immediately and without mercy. The danger wasn't that medieval people were tougher than you. It was that their entire world was structured around constraints you no longer recognize, let alone know how to navigate. The first threat you would face is not violence, but water, food, and your own body. Within your first day, you would likely drink water that appears clean but carries pathogens your immune system has never encountered. Medieval people did not understand germ theory, but they understood patterns. They knew which streams were safer, which wells were cursed by reputation, and which seasons made water lethal. This knowledge was hyper-local and passed orally. You would not have it. Food would be no safer. Medieval diets relied heavily on preservation methods, salting, drying, fermenting, that modern stomachs are often poorly adapted to. Bread was coarse, often partially spoiled by modern standards, and protein intake fluctuated wildly. A modern person skipping meals may feel hungry. A medieval person skipping meals risked immediate weakness because caloric intake was already marginal. You would feel the deficit within hours. Your body itself would betray you. Medieval life assumed constant low-level physical labor. Standing, squatting, lifting, and walking long distances were not workouts. They were baseline expectations. Your posture, footwear, and muscle conditioning would fail fast. Blisters, joint strain, and exhaustion would appear not after a march, but after a morning. Survival in medieval times began with metabolic and environmental adaptation, not heroics. Social ignorance would expose you faster than any enemy ever could. Medieval society was not informal. It was rule-bound in ways that were rarely written down and harshly enforced. You would not know who outranked you, who expected deference, or which gestures signaled insult. This ignorance was dangerous. Speech itself was a liability. Accents marked origin, vocabulary marked class. Asking the wrong question could imply espionage, heresy, or vagrancy. Medieval communities were small and insular. Outsiders were not neutral. They were risks. A stranger without a clear lord, trade, or purpose was assumed to be a criminal or a carrier of disease. Even basic movement was regulated. Roads, bridges, forests, and mills were often controlled by local authorities who charged tolls or required permission. Walking through the wrong field could be interpreted as theft. Cutting wood without rights could lead to mutilation or execution. You would not be punished because people were cruel. You would be punished because order depended on strict enforcement. Medieval survival required knowing exactly where you fit in a hierarchy before you spoke or moved. Disease was not a sudden catastrophe, but a constant background pressure. The popular image of medieval disease focuses on plagues, but daily illness was the real killer. Parasites, infected wounds, respiratory infections, and nutritional deficiencies were endemic. Medieval people developed partial tolerances over generations. You have not. Minor injuries were dangerous, not because medicine was ignorant, but because antiseptic practice was inconsistent and antibiotics did not exist. A blister could become infected. A cut could disable a hand. Fever could end productivity, which meant starvation. Medical treatment itself was risky. Remedies were based on humoral theory, astrology, and tradition. Some worked, many did not. Bloodletting, purging, and herbal mixtures could weaken a patient already on the edge. You would not know when to refuse treatment or which healer had a reputation for competence. Survival depended less on curing illness than on avoiding it entirely through habits learned from birth. You would not have those habits. Violence was structured, legal, and often unavoidable. Medieval violence was not random chaos. It was regulated by law, custom, and obligation. Lords could demand military service. Towns enforced collective punishment. Feuds followed rules that made them predictable to insiders and deadly to outsiders. If conflict arose, you could not simply leave. Travel required documents, money, and permission. Banditry flourished precisely because mobility was restricted. Roads were dangerous not because of constant ambush, but because protection was inconsistent. Weapons training was not universal. Most people did not fight unless required. When they did, they relied on formations, shields, and discipline rather than individual skill. A modern person raised on individualistic combat narratives would misunderstand medieval fighting immediately. More importantly, violence was often bureaucratic. Failure to pay taxes, fines, or rents could escalate to confiscation, imprisonment, or forced labor. You would not recognize these pressures as lethal until it was too late. Time itself worked against you in ways you no longer understand. Medieval people did not experience time as you do. There were no precise clocks governing daily life. Time was measured by daylight, bells, seasons, and religious calendars. Missing a deadline could mean missing a feast, a market, or a legal hearing. Markets were infrequent and essential. If you failed to secure food or supplies on the correct day, you waited weeks. Winter magnified every mistake. Storage, planning, and patience were survival skills. Rest was not guaranteed. Sleep followed rhythms dictated by labor and security, not personal preference. Nighttime was dangerous and unproductive. Staying awake after dark without reason raised suspicion. You would misjudge time constantly, exhausting yourself early and missing critical opportunities without realizing why. Psychological endurance mattered more than physical toughness. Medieval life offered little privacy, limited mobility, and almost no individual autonomy. Decisions were communal or imposed. Identity was fixed by birth, oath, and obligation. Modern people rely heavily on choice and personal agency for psychological stability. Remove those, and stress accumulates quickly. Medieval people were conditioned to endure monotony, discomfort, and authority. You are not. This psychological gap is often ignored in survival discussions. The inability to adapt mentally, to accept constraint without resentment, would undermine decision-making within hours. Survival was not about resisting the system. It was about functioning inside it. What medieval survival teaches us about preparedness today? The lesson is not that medieval people were superior, it is that survival depends on alignment with environment, culture, and constraint. Technology masks vulnerability, but it does not erase it. Modern survival failures often mirror medieval ones: ignorance of local conditions, overconfidence, social missteps, and delayed responses to small problems. The difference is that medieval consequences were immediate and final. Understanding medieval survival is not nostalgia. It is a reminder that resilience is learned, local, and often invisible until it is missing. Remembering these realities matters because history is not just a record of events, it is a catalogue of human limits and adaptations. Medieval people survived not through mythic toughness, but through systems that punished ignorance and rewarded conformity. If that world feels alien, it is because it was built on rules you no longer live by. If you value serious, in-depth historical analysis that goes beyond surface narratives, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts. Share this video with others who want to understand not just how people lived in the past, but why survival has always been harder than it looks.